Howdy folks, and welcome to an entirely optional video. You heard that right, an entirely optional video. So if at this point you've had more than your fill of concepts and you'd like to move on to some practical stuff, you've learned everything you really need to learn, so feel free to go ahead and skip this video and move on. For what it's worth, though, if you're feeling like you've got a lot more room in your head to squeeze in just one or two more concepts, this is a good opportunity to dig into something that's slightly more advanced, but, you know, it's kind of fun and kind of useful and good to know, right? Kind of bugged me for a long time, so I figured this is as good a place as any to show it to you. So, again, if you've got all the concepts you need, or you're feeling, your brain is kind of full, move on to the next video. If you want to see just a little bit more, well, keep on going with this video. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I'm here in Filter Revisers Part 1.xosx, and I'm in the Puzzle RC tab. So we're going to use sort of the same format before as the puzzle. We're going to look at this as though it were a single-celled organism. We're going to kind of use that metaphor. However, what we're going to look at is current row filtering and how it works. So in the previous example, we showed you override filters, which are in a lot of ways easier to think about. Here, we're looking at an example of current row filtering, kind of the one we've used over and over and over again. We go get all the dishes, and for each dish, we add this column to it, where for every row, we add the values of the current row, and then revise the filters by adding the values of the current row. Then this sub-expression unfreezes and runs onto those new filters. Okay, I think you've probably got that all right, but like, what does it look like, right? What's sort of happening in this cell right here? When we take the values of the current row and add them as filters, just like, how can I imagine that in my head? Well, I'm glad that you asked. Here's how you might imagine something like that in your head, right? Here's how you might imagine something like that in your head. Okay, same kind of thing as before, right? And we've got, we've got our calculate, and we've got sort of our sub-expression right there. Now, we don't have any override filters here. The only filter that's being added is the current row filter, specifically a filter for dish equals pasta, right? So you probably guessed this part okay. We pass in the sub-expression to the calculate function. There's the expression argument right there. At some point, that will get unfrozen and run. But when we add the current row value as a filter, what does that look like, right? Well, this isn't a second argument. There's no overrides provided. But we are going to get a filter for dish equals pasta in there, and the way we're going to get it in there is as such, right? For every particular cell, or not even for a cell, at any given moment in a DAX evaluation, we could talk about the current row, right? But a more nuanced version of describing the current row, right? It's not the exact same concept, but a very similar concept is the current row context, right? Row context is what's in the current row, right? So in the same way there's a filter context where for any given moment we could just say what filters are in place, there's also a row context, which is what are all the values of the current row. So for this cell right here, when we ask, what are the values of the current row? Well, there's actually, there's this table right here, this temp table. There's a temp table in the row context, which says the current row has a value for dish equals pasta, right? That's how we can imagine it. That's how we can imagine it. So the current row is nothing more than a table, a temp table. So as just in the same way with everything else in DAX, if you thought, hey, are there any more places where we could squeeze in having a temp table represent something? Well, sure enough, the current row is also represented as a temp table, or can be understood as a temp table. So what does this mean, and why am I bringing it up? What does this mean? Why am I bringing it up? Well, A, you may have heard the term row context before and kind of wondered what it is, right? Similarly, though, what we're going to do here, what calculate's going to do, is it's going to take the current row context for that particular cell right there, and for that particular cell, since it evaluates in this row, the current row context has this temp table of dish equals pasta. And what the calculate function is going to do is it's going to go find any values in the current row, dish equals pasta, and it's going to move them from the row context to the filter context. Or, said otherwise, it's going to transition them. Right? It's going to transition the temp table here from the row context to the filter context, which is why, if you've heard the term context transition before, that's why that term is used, right? Because for the more nuanced understanding, we're actually moving temp tables, table values, from the current row context to the filter context. We move them, right? That's what the process looks like. Okay, and so once that's in place, well, then, it's the same as before. We've got our new revised filter context that has the value of the current row transitioned from the row context to the filter context. And now we have our new revised filter context, and we can unfreeze our sub-expression and run it, right? So we take the sum x and we run it, and you sort of understand how this works. It pops out 5, and the whole thing pops out 5. But what's kind of interesting about this is we just sort of have a glimpse that when we're talking about the current row, we could just say dish equals pasta, and that's just fine. But internally, it's actually understanding it as a table, which is kind of interesting. Now, at this point, I'm going to kind of ask that you forget everything that you've seen on this page, because we're going to go back to talking about the current row as just the current row has a value for dish equals pasta. I'm not going to ask you to think of it as a table. I don't really necessarily want you to. You can if you want to, but I think that's more complex than we need for the rest of this this chapter. However, for folks that have been wondering, what do they mean when they say row context? This is kind of what we mean. This is kind of what we mean, which is sort of a question that bothered me for a long time. So hopefully I illuminated that for you. And with that, I think we're done with all this conceptual stuff. We can actually move on and go do some practical stuff. So I sure hope that was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.